This week I'll show you how I removed the original suspension from my MGB Roadster, redesigned it to incorporate coilovers and adjustable 4-link suspension, and then refit it to my solid body shell. And I went to the gym as well. Right, we're doing the 4-link axle swap on the Roadster today. However, the garage is full of unnecessary toys. Frog eye forward, tractor out into the back garden, bikes back there, Roadster where the tractor is now. That's the plan. Whether or not it works, forgot about the wheelie bin and the lawnmower, but we'll figure that out. Bit of a tight squeeze, but we're fine. We've got about 8mm there, and then this side we've got probably about 1 centimetre, but that flaps about a bit. We had a little bit of trouble getting up, so started wheel spinning here, and then obviously they've got brakes on either side, so the wheel that was spinning, because I don't know why, it's still got 1.6mm across 3/4 of the tread. You can brake this axle, so I started braking this one to send the power to the other wheel, and then it shot off up the hill. I had to slam on because I nearly hit the wall. Yeah, she's back here now. Get to look out on that every morning. Lovely jubbly. First step then is get the car up in the air, get the wheels off, and we'll see what we're dealing with. So I get these little rubber caps off eBay, and basically I put those over the top of these tuner nuts. It just stops everything getting rusty, and they just look a little bit better than, yeah, if you've used these things before, you know, well, they end up looking like that. And just a bit grim, aren't they? So chuck a cap over the top of it. Lovely. I've mentioned before, this is my daily driver, and the reason that I'm pulling this off the road at the moment is because I got the Bluetooth shock upgrade. You can probably see up there where it's sheared off. Well, I thought it had sheared off, but it looks like the bolt might have just come out. Huh. Oh well, we're committed now. We've taken the wheels off, we may as well swap the axle out. Just have a look underneath, and it's actually remarkably solid, this car. There's a bit of surface rust coming through. The sills need replacing, but the actual castle rails and rest of the floor pans all look pretty decent. Whilst we're at it, I'm going to be cutting this battery tray out at the bottom. The battery's relocated into the boot now, so we'll cut that out for a bit of extra access, and then I'm going to be sorting out the brake lines as well, replacing those, possibly fitting a hydraulic handbrake whilst we're at it. I'm going to remove the axle check straps now, which we're not going to need, as these are inbuilt into the new coilovers which will be going onto the car. And also the bump stops as well are also incorporated into the coilovers. These can sometimes be a little bit tricky to get off. If you do struggle, WD-40 or Fairy Liquid helps here. Next off are the 2 bolts that hold the top mount for the telescopic shock conversion. I will be reusing this to turn into my own coilover top mount. So you can see the handbrake cable, which comes in via this point here and then pulls on the lever at the back of the drums there. You can see that the floating bracket system has failed. These have 2 functions. Firstly, it locates the cable, stopping it knocking on the exhaust, but it also stops the excess weight from the cable dragging on the handbrakes. Obviously the handbrake has to come off, and then I'll take the exhaust off as well so we can lower the axle. The only other things we need to unbolt from this side would be the front leaf spring and the rear leaf spring shackle. You can see here I welded a piece of stainless straight onto the exhaust, which allows me to use one of these universal type rubbers which are available at most auto parts stores. It looks a lot tidier than the original exhaust hanger solution as well. The front fasteners I swapped to these springs, which are easy to remove but also help with the ground clearance with this car being so low. I get a lot of people asking me how I managed to get this car to sit so low versus other MGBs. On the back here you can see that I've used 2-inch Ford Escort lowering blocks, and I'll be covering in more depth shortly how I've done this. Once you've undone the lower 4 U-clamp nuts, use a jack to lift the axle up, whilst the car's also on jack stands, that way you don't have to try and separate the clamps from the axle assembly. Next up is to remove the 2 9/16 nuts that hold the rear leaf spring shackle on. You should be able to pull these shackles out relatively easily now. If you do struggle, you can use WD-40 or Fairy Liquid again. Put a spanner or some sort of lever in against the chassis to pull them out that way. Get the bush out, and then I tend to replace all hardware when I'm doing things like this, but some people like to refurb the original hardware, so this will all be good used parts for somebody that's looking to do a chrome bumper leaf spring swap on a rubber bumper car. Been a while since I've done a front one of these, so I can't remember what size. Shame on me for not knowing MGB socket sizes. If there's anything that ever fights you on these cars, it's these bloody front bolts. They're an absolute pain. Don't try this at home. Unfortunately, as I suspected, it feels like that bolt is seized in there. I will try again, for giggles. But I've got a feeling I'll be running an angle grinder up and slitting along each edge. There's something missing there, isn't there? I took care not to damage the body or the spring either. So there we are, so the axle's ready to come out on this side now. We've just got to repeat the process on the other side. Oh, and remove the prop shaft as well. So nut and bolt recap then, the ones on the back there are 9/16. The lower U-clamps, 9/16, and then the front one is a 22mm angle grinder. So we'll get this big rusty axle out of the way now. If you don't have a gym membership, now's a good time to get a couple of extra squats in. I think they're about 65 to 70 kilos, these rear axles. Now the axle's out of the way, we can get underneath with the angle grinder and start cutting away the old battery box. Unfortunately, as I came around to the driver's side to start cutting the battery box, I went to remove the petrol line. The steel pipe has corroded so much that it's failed. Unfortunately, that's leaked fuel everywhere, so I'm going to go ahead and start removing the wiring loom and a few other little bits that don't involve cutting the battery tray while there's fuel vapours everywhere. Another failure point on these, you don't see it so much, but there's basically all these like clips that hold the wiring loom in certain places. It just moves around a little bit, it just starts rubbing through. You see this one's been repaired at some point already as well. It's not such a common issue, that actually. The only wire that needs to remain underneath the car is the fuel sensor sender wire. There's a few old wires from the electric fuel pump that are loitering around underneath here that can get deleted. So I'm actually going to run the new loom when I replace it over the inside of the rear wheel liner and into the boot that way, just to tidy things up a little bit underneath the car for simplicity, but also if you're fault finding and you're at the side of the road, you really don't want to be crawling around and messing around with this dirty wire underneath the car. So of the other things that are underneath the car then, so we've got the wiring loom obviously, we've got the brake line which I'll be running inside the car as I'll be coming off the back of the hydraulic handbrake that I'll be fitting. And then we've also got a battery cable which runs underneath the car to the front where the starter motor is and the alternator. That would usually link up to the battery box where the battery would sit inside here. So that'll get run inside the car, as well as I'll be running a new fuse box for the MX-5 engine and tucking that away underneath the dash somewhere. And the only other item there is the fuel line, which I won't be running inside the car. It'll maintain the original route just from a safety point of view. All of these fasteners on 7/16, and then this one random one on the cross member, which is half inch. My first question would be, why did the MG company decide to run the wiring loom through this hole, yet everything else underneath the car runs through that nice little grommet, which is easy to remove? I'm slightly sour because I didn't click that the loom at the front unclips about 3 foot down the line from here. Meanwhile, threading the entire rear wiring loom through this little hole. See inside the boot, this is just terrible. That obviously doesn't work, and that indicator. All the wires just loitering around, and then they come from factory down here and then come round. So my plan is to go over the top of the wheel arch there, which leads into the car, and then just tuck the cable down and then go around the outside edge. And whilst we're at it, we'll spruce all this up and just make it look a little bit less that, I suppose. The saga continues, me threading through the rear part of the wiring loom, and then of course panning to the front when I did click that you can actually disconnect these at the front, and that would have been a lot quicker. Now the wiring's on the bench, then you can see the state that this loom's actually in. It's definitely been off at some point and messed with, so I'm just going to strip the entire thing back and give it a once over. It also gives me an opportunity to clean it up, because it's absolutely filthy. I've gone down the majority of the length there of the rear loom. I'm just going through now and I'm going to start rewrapping it from the front. This isn't wasted when I swap to the MX-5 loom, because anything that I do put in or take out of here now is going to be reused anyway, so it'll just be cut a little bit shorter when the fuse box gets moved into the car. I don't need the light for the boot anymore. I don't have one of those in the car. There's 2 red wires for the side lights, one for the left, one for the right. I'm going to get rid of one of those because I always keep a spare length of wire in the car. It's there so that if you do lose one of your rear lights, the other one still works. However, if you do have any problems, then you've got to fault find 2 wires, and of course they're both red as well, so you end up chasing both wires anyway. And then the other one that I'm going to delete is the green and brown wire, which is for the reversing lights, which are not legally required in the UK, so I'm going to get rid of that as well. Back to the car, and I'm going to drill a 25mm hole in the bottom of the quarter panel here, which will hold a grommet, and then the wiring loom will thread through the grommet. Point I'm going to have to do a little bit of work on the arches here, so I'm just thinking about that wire routing, and what I'm going to do is I've got 2 holes here. I'm going to thread a cable tie through and just strap the wiring loom onto this side of the arch. That way if I do any cutting in the future, I'm not going to end up with a cut wire. I'm hoping that those fuel fumes are gone enough now that we can continue with grinding. So, could do with marking this now and making it, so we want to make a nice job of this. With the battery box gone then, it's time to get underneath and remove as much dirt and loose rust as possible. Again, this is my daily driver and I'm without a car at the moment, so I'm trying to keep the ball rolling, as well as not do too bad a job that I'll be coming back to this in the next couple of years. So I've mounted the coilovers onto the old telescopic shock top mounts. This will obviously be in single shear if you mounted them like this, and that doesn't sit quite well with me. So what I'm going to do is sort of bridge across the top of the coilover, come down and then bolt through the two pieces of metal, and then I will be bolting up into the boot floor as well. So there's two pieces of steel here that I've recently cut out of a caravan chassis. They look in pretty good condition and they're matched in terms of profile, so I'll put those on the top there and just mark up roughly where they need to be cut. This is 50mm across, so if you get some 50x50 angle iron, that will work just as well. I'm just using the calipers in the correct way that every other engineering shop uses them, and then I just need to get underneath the car to measure the length of angle that I'll need. I marked that out underneath the car just to save a little bit of forward and backwards, and then just offer it up to sense check that everything looks okay. So I cut that down to size, and now it's back to the bench to drill the hole for the shock absorber bolt to go through. So I made a bit of a mistake drilling the hole in this side, and the coilover wouldn't butt up against because I drilled too close to the top of there. So you can see how I've drilled a little bit lower down now to allow the body to clear. So I haven't made a mistake on this side, I just inadvertently didn't know that I was working on the other side. That's what we'll go with. So I need to move all that to the other side now, and we'll do that side first. So that's the piece that I've made. We bolt through the coilover. You see it's just clear on the top now, before it was clashing with the top. So we'll stack a bead of weld down there and tidy this all up. Bolt through there now. So we'll drill a hole in the top there to bolt into the body shell floor. And then whilst we're at it as well, I'll be welding a little piece on the front just to tie it into the anti-roll bar mounting area. Belt and braces, but really can you be too strong when you're building things like this? And that's how the finished products have turned out. So I'll go over the welds and just tidy up a few bits where I need to, and then I can bolt these onto the cars with the coilovers before we start stripping down the old rear axle to take out the parts that we need. I pop the drums off the old rear axle and pull out the braking components that we'll be reusing. A lot of the hardware in here has been recently replaced, so it just makes sense to clean up what we can and reuse what we can. All the gubbins from the brake shoe setup will be going into the ultrasonic cleaner for a quick bath. You can literally see the grease just falling off these things. Whilst they're having a good soak, I'm going to move on to the handbrake levers. One of these is seized so much that I can't move it by hand, so I'm going to have to open these up in the vise and spray a little bit of lubricating spray into there as well. This would explain some of the poor braking performance that I've had recently. Another part that I need to salvage from the old axle is the hubs. The 4-link axle that I've got is actually a wire wheel axle, which is 1.75 inches narrower. I'm not sure if there's any strength differences between the two. I would say that the shorter wire wheel axle would be slightly stronger, as well as slightly lighter, but it was just what I had on the shelf at the time. To get the rear hubs off, I usually give them a quick blast of heat with a blowtorch, and then they come off pretty easily with a bearing puller. A lot of people asking me about these escort lowering blocks on an MGB. So if you look at the diameter of this pin that comes up from the leaf springs, so I don't know what it is in imperial, I'm not 16.5mm. And if you look at the escort ones, so that's the that would go onto there like that. If you look at the escort ones, they're quite a lot bigger, so I ended up 3D printing these little adapters. See, with that removed, comes back at 22mm. So it's just a little piece of, it's like a plastic bush. It's only there to locate it. Once it's located, all of the weight actually goes around the outside edges of these. You'll see how they sit. It's always on the outside edges, that's why you have to tighten them up again once the car's under its own weight. So whilst everything's out, it's good practice to just give everything a bit of a clean. It did look like there was a slight build-up of fluid on one of the pads, whether that was oil or brake fluid, I'm not sure, but I'm going to go ahead and replace both rear brake cylinders as a precaution. These pads have not been in the car that long, I think maybe about a year, so I'll reuse these to make sure that they go on the same side. The brake adjusters that I pulled out then, so they're made up of these pins with a taper on that sort of screw into the back, and they're mate up against a wedge like so. So the more you screw them in, the more they wedge out, and that's just to account for the wear on the brake pads. So you can see this one's fully assembled with the two pistons in there, and as you screw it in, you can see that the cylinders push out, and when you screw it back, cylinders push back together. So if you imagine that's in between the two shoes on the back, and that's how you would compensate for the wear. If your brakes are feeling a little bit spongy, or your handbrake has excess travel, one of the reasons could be that these adjusters need screwing back in. I'll be running a flexi brake line from front to rear with a brake at the hydraulic handbrake, but the rear axle I'll be replacing with solid brake line. It's worth checking that everything that's going to be in close proximity to the brake line isn't going to knock on it, in this case the coilovers during suspension travel. There's 1001 different brake flaring tools that you can use. The best ones that you can actually get, I find, are the ones that are vice mounted, that you put in, and they're like an op1, op2, and you just pull it down like a big lever. The money that they cost, bang for buck, I don't think you can actually get a better version than this, personally. So first thing you need to do, push your pipe up into here, tighten these guys down. Not too crazy, just nip them up. You'll see that you've got your pipe poking through the end there. To set the depth, you put this nut down. You can see it just pushed the pipe out a tiny bit there. At that point, you tighten this down. Take that nut out, and then you've got this, which does your op1. And your op2 as well for your reverse or normal flare. Op1 that side. So you throw that into there, and then it's just a case of letting that down. Undo everything. Yeah, and then that's it. There's your brake flare. Done. Lovely. No drama. No fuss. No sore hands. So, eat, sleep, repeat on that one. Keen eyes amongst you then will be noticing that I'm reusing the fittings that came with the car. If these were modern fittings, they would be made from steel and therefore rusted out. The fact that they are the original ones means they're made from brass, so there's absolutely no rust, no corrosion, no reason why we can't reuse those. Whilst everything's out and we're doing the rebuild, then it makes sense to me to throw the diff oil in. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this plug. It's just slightly smaller than a 1/2 inch drive socket. What I've got, a socket that was way past it. You can see it's got a really stubby top on it because it's just been hit with a hammer that many times. So I ground a couple of flats a little bit further down, and then I used that in there. So one perk of doing this while the axle's out is you can actually just roll everything over. And as long as you know how much oil you need to put in here. I hate gear oil, it's sticky and messy and it makes you itch. So if I don't have to do it while it's under the car, I won't. Before I assemble those, I'll chuck a touch of grease on there. Just one helps it go on, two helps it come off in the future as well. It might actually be me that works on this next, so I like to look after the next guy. Dapperoo. I'll put the hub nuts on, but the torque required for these is an insane number. I feel like it's around 200 Newton meters or something from memory, so I'll just put the nuts on loosely but leave the socket on there so that I'm reminded to tighten these up when the vehicle's back on the floor. I just like to put a bit of paint on there just to give them some sort of protection because they come with no paint on. So that pushes in. And of course, the hole doesn't line up with the pin that it's supposed to. Good job. So I know that it's not ideal, but I'm just going to go ahead and remove those pins. The reason I say it's not ideal is not from a point of view of fitment, so I know that that pin's not really going to do much once the brakes are on there. Everything's sort of held in the correct position anyway, but as far as I'm aware, there's two different types. So the hole on the back of these, the Roadster and the GT, both had different weights. So because of that, they had more or less rear braking. So I'm not sure what I've got here. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Probably going to end up putting a bias valve on here anyway, so it doesn't really make much difference to me. But right, next up is these seat clips, which they go onto the back of the cylinder like so to locate it, but on the other side of this disc, on the other side of the back plate. I don't know if there is a hell, but if there is, there's likely just somebody fitting these constantly. If you know anybody with forearms, good pals with Ganeshi, maybe this is a job for him. And lever it up until both bits are started like that, and it's just a case of pushing it back. Next on the hit list is the brake adjusters. If you remember to wind these all the way out and put them in the fully out position. And then what I like to do, chuck a tiny bit of grease on that back face so you don't get any corrosion between this and the back plate. I think there's a gasket that goes in here from factory, but and then that goes onto there like so. And then on the back side, I'm just going to use two stainless washers and then some lock nuts. I think from factory they come with the standard type nut and a locking washer, but they always just cause corrosion as well. So looking at those, then the washers are only just engaging, so what I'm going to do is take those out, put a little drop of Loctite in there, and that's the end of that then. Next step then would be the brake shoes. You're buying one of these machines and expecting miracles, that's not what happens. You don't get rid of rust and that sort of thing, so you can see there's still quite a lot of surface rust on these parts. But they are pretty clean. I mean, that one looks good, doesn't it? Probably just want to wipe down and they're ready for paint. These little springs and everything looks loads better. Look at those, they're like new. At this point, some of you may have noticed that there was actually one spring missing. Thankfully I don't ever throw anything away, so there's quite a good stash of parts under the bench. Otherwise it'd be a frustrating wait for a new set. Let's see if there's anything else we might need whilst we're in here. So before I start with the brake shoe install, I like to set one up on the floor just so that I know what I'm replicating when it comes to putting it onto the backplate. You can look through the Moss catalogue or the Haynes manual if you like, but I personally don't find the diagrams very useful. They don't show you which holes all the springs go into, which would be easy for them to do with a dotted line. What I tend to do is go onto Google and type in MGB rear brakes, and you can get plenty of pictures of what they're supposed to look like on there. The rear handbrake levers can only go in one logical way. If you put them in upside down, you'll find that they brush up against the rear brake cylinders. Before you put them in, go ahead and slap a load of grease in there, just try and stop them seizing up in the future. Sometimes it can be a bit of a juggling act putting the springs onto the shoes onto the back plate, but nothing should require excess force. The top spring is probably the most fiddly one, as it has to go on after you've assembled the lower parts. The last spring to go in is the big spring that goes across the handbrake lever. Again, this can only go one logical way, and it hits the brake cylinder if you install incorrectly. Once you've levered that into position, just pull on the back levers and make sure that everything's moving freely, and then you can install the pins which hold the brake shoes in. The best method to install these would be a pair of pliers to push the cup against the spring, unless you have bionic hands like myself. I've done a fair few of these on now, and if you just use all your might, you can push them on my hand. The last thing to do is put the brake drums on, and then we can move on to do the other side. It's now onto the 4 triangulated control arms. There's 8 bushes to install in these. I like to use a little bit of grease on these poly bushes. It seems to enhance the life of them. Some people tend to put them in dry. I notice if you buy bushes from Super Pro, they come with grease in the kit. The bushes tend to go in easily, but I like to send them home in the vise just to make sure they're fully seated. The last thing to do on the axle before it's ready to go onto the car is to install the hard brake lines. I was waiting for some brake unions to turn up, which is why I'm only finishing these now, but I'll also be covering the entire line in a heat shrink shield, just to try and keep any corrosion at bay. One obvious disadvantage to this is any corrosion you cannot see, so it just does make sense to make sure you can do as good a job as possible here just to stop anything getting inside. You can see the paint work on the axle here. I think it was slightly too cold for the paint to cure properly, so it's ended up with like a cracking texture. That was just in the primer that I put down. I've put down another layer since then, and then of course the top coat on top. But again, this is not really going to be a show car, so I'm not overly fussed about that. So one of the points to note on the axle then, the T piece for the rear, I've put on with this orientation. I don't believe that's correct for the MGB from factory, but the rear brake line, rather than having a rubber hose that connects into this, or from this side I believe it comes up to the side of the battery box, I'm going to be using a banjo fitting, so my fitting's going to come straight down and then there's going to be a bolt that goes through it. So that orientation works best for me, that's the only reason that I've done that. Another point of interest is probably the breather. So the standard MGB breather is a piece of plastic that would usually sit on top of the axle like so. However, I didn't have room because that's where we mounted the brackets for the triangulation, the 4-link. So what I've done instead is just chuck one of these little motorcycle ones in. You can just see they're a little bit shorter, only about 10mm in it, but yeah, nicer as well, aluminium versus plastic. Quick overview of how we've done the triangulation then. So you can see that these top ones would triangulate up to where the anti-roll bar mounts, and the bottom ones run perfectly parallel with where the lower leaf spring mounts would usually go. I've run this setup in my MGB with the Jag 3-litre V6. They're not fully triangulated on that, but I've checked the pickup points and everything works. We've not had any issues with strength regarding using the anti-roll bar mounting points. just in case anyone had any concerns over that. But this Roadster is going to be a lot lighter, and it's only going to have the MX-5 engine in there, so it's going to be under a lot less stress anyway. But I will be closely monitoring just to check that everything's held up. We've triangulated the top here just to give it a little bit of load spreading, and then also the same on the bottom of these plates. Overall, looking pretty tidy. So let's get it on the car then, shall we? It's a bit of a wrestling match to get the rear axle into a position that's somewhat near enough that you can connect all of the arms up. You do tend to just set the height and the location of the axle roughly, and then you'll have to do a little bit of manhandling and jiggering around with the axle stand heights just to sort of get everything in the correct location. But yeah, I did do this by myself, which I tend to not do these sort of things underneath a car. If you're by yourself, get a friend to do it with you. One, it's less strain on your back, your body, that sort of thing. But two, if you do drop something, or if the car drops, you're absolutely screwed if you're stuck underneath it by yourself. One thing I will say, if you do really have to work on a car like this by yourself, always keep your mobile phone in your pocket. Last thing to figure out now before we take the jack stands off is how thick that washer there needs to be. So these ones go on the inside there, like so. I'm just going to go to my washer drawer and look for something that's just a touch thicker than that nut. I've got nothing else to hand down here that I can measure with. So I came back with these. Oh, they're about a mil too loose, really. That's a bit annoying. Do have two of them as well. The hunt continues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these ones in for now, and then I'm going to make up a couple that I will replace them with. I've just dry assembled everything underneath. I've left all the bolts loose because there will be some slight changes that I'll be making to the geometry, just fine tuning where the axle sits. But for now I just want to roll the car out so I can turn it round and start working on the MX-5 engine conversion. So I'll be lowering it down just to see what it looks like. The suspension is currently set in the highest position possible. I would like the car to sit around an inch lower at the bottom, just so that the outer of the tyre is concentric to the wheel arch. Of course, once the weight is back on the vehicle, you can torque up the rear hub nuts. Overall, I'm happy with how everything's looking at the moment. The axle actually needs to move back around 10mm, and then obviously with the narrower rear end, I've ordered some 25mm spacers just to bring the wheels back out to suit the wheel arches. Most things being considered then, overall weight saving this week comes back at around 13 kilograms all in. Hopefully next week I'll have a video update of how the MX-5 swap's coming on. Thanks for watching.